Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess this evening, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and this evening we have with us the president of the Center for International Environmental Law, Mr. Carroll Muffet. Sir, thank you once again for joining us in this program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the last time that we spoke, I believe it would have been in June, and at that time we would have been discussing the impact of flaring by ExxonMobil. And during that time, I think the level, it was at 9 billion cubic feet of gas. We are now way over that. We're over 10 billion cubic feet. And I would love for us to get into a discussion about the effects of that and how seriously Guyanese need to take this subject matter. But before we do, I'd like us to look a little bit at the industry. Now, Guyana is one of the few places where oil and gas operations are still ongoing despite the COVID-19 pandemic, and it remains, according to some industry analysts, the crown jewel for companies such as ExxonMobil, Hess Corporation, and CNOOC Nexen. Could you give us your perspective, sir, on how important Guyana is to these oil companies, even as they experience financial difficulties during this pandemic?
So I think it's useful to focus here on Exxon because I think it is both the largest actor in Guyana and the one about which we have the greatest information. And I think if you look at Exxon's current financial situation, and indeed the financial situation that was developing for the country over the last several years, what you see is that this is a company in many ways facing fundamental challenges to its long-term business model. And those fundamental challenges to its long-term business model have been dramatically accelerated by the events of the pandemic. It's worth recognizing that just on Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average kicked Exxon off the Dow 30, which is used to track the economy. For 90 years, Exxon has been a member of the Dow Jones 30 list because it was considered a marquee of here are the companies you track if you want to understand where the economy is going. That's no longer true. Exxon's been kicked off the Dow. In 2019, it also lost its place on the Standard & Poor's list. This is a company whose stock values have been plummeting for nearly a decade, whose value has dropped in half in the last few years, and who has reported a series of quarterly losses. And if you look back to last year, it was losing money even in the parts of its portfolio that it said were its long-term growth opportunities, like petrochemicals. And so this is a company that was already in really bad shape coming into the pandemic. And the pandemic has really accelerated that crisis for Exxon. If you look at what Exxon said were its major long-term growth plays over the last few years, those growth plays were first, the Permian Basin in the US, which was ostensibly the biggest. But even before the pandemic began, Exxon had decided to reduce the number of oil rigs that it had in the Permian Basin. And now it has slashed that number of oil rigs because the economics don't make sense. Between the end of last year and the end of this year, Exxon will have cut the number of those rigs in the Permian Basin by 75% because
Wow.
The economics of the Permian are no longer Exxon's big play. So what else was Exxon looking to do? Well, Exxon was also it was telling investors that another of its big plays was in petrochemicals and plastics, and arguing to investors that the world needs more plastics. That has proven overly optimistic as well, which is why Exxon lost $300 million in its chemicals business at the end of last year, and why we see prices for plastics and other petrochemical feedstocks struggling in the wake of the pandemic. And so that brings us to oil outside the U.S. And here, again, Exxon had several major plays. The most important of these, Exxon said over and over and over again, was Guyana. But there were others. There was, for example, Mozambique, where Exxon was promoting a massive natural gas facility. The negotiations in Mozambique have been bogged down by the fact that that project has been contributing to violent unrest in the country. As a result of which, Exxon has now delayed any action on the Mozambique project for at least a couple of more years. And so it doesn't have that to offer investors anymore. And so its other big project was Papua New Guinea. That was the last of the major projects. And here too, that project has been in trouble since the beginning of this year, when Papua New Guinea walked away from the deal because they said the financial aspects of the deal were fundamentally unfair to Papua New Guinea, and they wanted to renegotiate. And that has left that project in limbo as well. And so I think when you look at Exxon, its situation is increasingly dire. It is paying out more in its annual dividend, $15 billion a year, than it's bringing in revenue, which means it's having to take on more and more debt to pay its dividend to its shareholders. And I think from Exxon's perspective, that's important because Guyana remains the last truly positive, promising growth story that Exxon has to sell to potential investors. And my own take on that is that the reason the Guyana story is still so promising for Exxon is because the terms of it are so fundamentally unfair to Guyana that it's effectively free money for Exxon. And so when you see the president of Exxon Guyana saying in a statement yesterday that that under prevailing market conditions, it might not make sense for Exxon to invest in Guyana if Guyana changes the deal. I think the fundamental question there is, well, if it's not economic for Exxon to do this while still being fair to the Guyanese people, maybe it's just fundamentally not economic at all.
That's a good point for us to move to my next question. So the president of ExxonMobil Guyana, as you rightly said, Mr. Alistair Routledge, said yesterday that if they don't get what they're looking for with the Payara field development plan, they can take their investment elsewhere. And I wanted to know, from your experience in dealing with companies such as ExxonMobil, how you've seen this company behaving where environmental issues are concerned, and how it is treated with nations that are asking for a better deal on the exploitation of its resources. How do you see this posture of the company, and what sort of message do you think it should send to our new government and to the people of Guyana?
So, I will say that, I was particularly struck by that statement yesterday. And it's a cliche in movies that often when you encounter a bully, when you look behind the facade, you find that the bully is actually someone who's very frightened. And I think Exxon's behavior echoes that. I think that when Exxon says, if Guyana doesn't like this deal, Exxon will take its money and go elsewhere. I think the reasonable question back to Exxon is, well, where do you plan to go? Because I've just walked through all of the other places where Exxon said it had major resources to invest, and it's already reducing its resource investments in all of those places. Exxon actually pulled, most recently, Exxon has pulled its staff from one of these projects in ostensibly in the name of COVID. But the truth is, it is suspending major investments and suspending its capital expenditures across the board. And so if Exxon says it has someplace better to go than Guyana, I think it's reasonable to ask Exxon where precisely that is and then maybe ask the people on the other end of that deal what they think about Exxon's answer.
So, in your belief, this is definitely not a posture of intimidation, but just a bully who's actually afraid.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
My question was, so in your belief, this is not necessarily a posture of intimidation. This is just a bully who is actually afraid.
Well, and I think those things are very consistent. I think Exxon is absolutely trying to intimidate Guyana. But I think if you look at Exxon's behavior recently, it is the behavior of a bully, and the nature of a bully is they can't let down that facade for a moment. I think one of the things that's really striking is that Exxon rather than paying penalties that the EPA opposed for pollution arising from Exxon's operations, penalties that I believe arise to a grand total of $3,000. Rather than pay those fines, Exxon has instead brought in a raft of lawyers to oppose them. And I think that speaks volumes, because I guarantee you that Exxon is spending more on those lawyers than it would spend simply paying the fines. And so I think that for Exxon, this is really about power and really about demonstrating its belief that it is in the driver's seat in this project.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to go to some environmental issues now that are plaguing the Payara field development plan. So, from the Kaieteur News perspective, we would have done our work and found out that there are two issues in particular that are of concern where this project is concerned. One is related to produced water. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency wants ExxonMobil to, instead of disposing of the treated produced water into the ocean, the EPA wants ExxonMobil to inject this water because, according to World Bank standards, dumping the water into the ocean should be a last resort. Now, ExxonMobil is opposed to this, and it's also opposed to the Environmental Protection Agency tightening loopholes in the LISA 1 and LISA 2 permit, which would allow for flaring, much like the situation that we're dealing with right now. And they're using the excuse of experiencing difficulties with fixing the gas compressor system, etc. So, given those two issues, we have been unable to get the company to agree. What is your take on the posture of the company where these matters are concerned, and how crucial do you think Guyana should stand? How crucial it is, do you believe, for the country to stand its ground on these matters?
I think it's imperative for Guyana to stand its ground, because I think it's important to recognize that you're at the very beginning of this process. You're at the very beginning of this industry, and experience around the world, and indeed experience in Guyana's waters just the last few months, demonstrates how dangerous and how polluting it can be. And therefore it's imperative, I think, for Guyana to hold Exxon to the standards that the Guyanese people believed that they were securing. I think if you look at the impacts of the flaring, Exxon has flared 10 billion 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas and counting. To put that figure in perspective, that's the equivalent of burning 1.7 million barrels of oil. In 2017, Guyana's entire electricity sector only burned 1.8 million barrels of oil. And so the flaring from that operations is burning nearly as much oil as Guyana's entire electricity sector. And if you look at how much oil Guyana burned for transportation, for cars and buses and trucks in 2017, that was only 1.9 billion barrels of oil. And so you see this single flaring event at a single well from Exxon burning an amount of oil that's equivalent to what the country does across entire electricity or transport sectors for a year. This is staggering. And it's important to recognize that if Exxon gets away, there will be many more operations like this to come. And so it becomes imperative that the country hold the company to very high standards. The last thing I'd say on this is absolutely about produced water, and it's about the impacts of flaring. It also needs to be much more seriously about the potential risks of a major oil spill. I was re-evaluating the environmental impact assessment for Liza 1 just in the last week, and it is staggering how incredibly optimistic the worst case scenario is for an oil spill from those operations. And I think that raises really fundamental questions, because we've seen, whether it's in Mauritius or the risk of leaks into the Red Sea, we've seen how even comparatively small amounts of oil have massive economic and environmental and human impacts. And I think the Guyanese people deserve a much clearer look and a much more detailed look at what those impacts could really be.
Thank you, Mr. Muffet. What could you share with us in terms of your personal experience with companies like ExxonMobil? Has it ever tried to silence you or other defenders of the environment? And if so, what key lessons do you believe Guyana should take from that?
Yeah, and I think the answer here is an emphatic yes. Mm-hmm. Exxon has tried repeatedly and aggressively to silence many of its critics, me included. On the day after the U.S. presidential election in November 2016, I received a hand-dated, hand-signed subpoena from ExxonMobil, hand-delivered to me, ordering me to turn over an incredible amount of documents touching on nearly every aspect of my work. And I wasn't alone in this. And this subpoena remains, this subpoena remains of uncertain status to this day. I was one of many people to receive subpoenas like this. We've seen Exxon sue lawyers. We've seen Exxon intimidate witnesses in a fraud case brought by the state of New York. We have seen, CIEL was among a number of organizations and individuals who have been investigating Exxon, who were the subject of a paid hacking for hire operation that spanned nearly 2 years. Now, who was responsible for that hacking for hire operation hasn't been determined. But what is clear is that many of the groups that were targeted had one thing in common, that they'd been investigating Exxon. Exxon's denied its involvement in it. But it's also worth noting that Exxon has a long history of denying things that ultimately turn out to be true. I think that if you look at Exxon's history, it is very aggressive in trying to silence its critics. But by the same token, it's been generally unsuccessful. People around the world, myself included, have been standing up to Exxon and have no intention of backing down.
So your advice to Guyana, regardless of the intimidation, whatever tactics that may come its way from ExxonMobil, that under no circumstance should we cede our ground?
I think the people of Guyana are the people who are going to live with the consequences of this oil development, regardless of how it goes. And so they are entitled to fully understand the scope of the deal they've agreed. They are entitled to fully understand the risks. They're entitled to fully and better understand the potential benefits that those risks will be weighed against. And I don't think to date they've really received that. And so absolutely, I think the people of Guyana, are entitled to and should demand an accounting of all of this, up to and including, how the potential benefits for Guyana outweigh the many and very, very clear and potentially catastrophic risks.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, sir. We are going to go to a quick commercial break, and when we return, we will continue our discussion, first focusing on flaring. Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. If you're now joining us, this is a special edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess this evening, a senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and we have with us the president of the Center for International Environmental Law, Mr. Carroll Muffet. Sir, we would have discussed ExxonMobil's posture, the importance of Guyana to its portfolio, and some of the environmental issues that we've been experiencing with this company and the importance of Guyana standing its ground. I'd like to take you to another issue that we would have discussed the first time we had you on our program, and that is about flaring. So when we first met, we started talking about the issue of flaring, the importance, and the fact that ExxonMobil has flared over 9 billion cubic feet of gas. It's now over 10. But there are a lot of people who still don't understand why this is important. Why should it matter to me? This is something that's happening 120 miles off the coast of the country. Why should it matter to every man, woman, and child? I'd appreciate it if you can take just a few minutes to explain that importance to our listeners.
Certainly. And I think the impacts of flaring vary widely based on where the flaring is located. We know, for example, that flaring in important bird areas and migratory bird pathways can have really significant impact on local bird populations. And Guyana is, in fact, an incredibly important stop on migratory bird pathways throughout South America and beyond. We know that flaring can have a host of other impacts on the local environment, and when flaring occurs in near coastal waters and when flaring occurs on shore, there are an array of toxins that are released: benzene, formaldehyde, toluene, xylene, more than 60 other hazardous air pollutants that have been associated with a raft of serious human health impacts, including effects on fetal birth weight. And so I think there are serious reasons for concern whenever flaring occurs and wherever flaring occurs. What the impacts are within Guyana's waters are hard to say because Exxon didn't properly assess them. And I think this is one of the things that is really striking, again, when you look at the environmental impact assessment, is that Exxon cherry-picked where it would look in terms of the potential impact areas for its operations. And, while it may be a comfort for people in Georgetown that this massive ongoing flaring is occurring offshore, that may be of less comfort to the people in Barbados and other nearby countries that are downwind of that site. And the environmental impact assessment didn't look at that at all. And so I think my answer to that is that, whether there are potential onshore risks to the people in Guyana from the hazardous substances that are being flared at really significant volumes, I don't have the expertise to assess. By the same token, I think somebody should have assessed them and assessed them better than was done in that environmental impact assessment. And by the same token, I believe that it would be both responsible and wise for the people of Guyana in assessing the impact of this project to look not only on its impacts on Guyanese waters, but on the nearby countries that are in the downstream pathway of the plumes of pollutants that are coming off of these operations. And had Exxon looked at that in a more comprehensive way, we would be able to answer better what are those risks. Right now, if anyone knows, it's Exxon, and they're not saying.
Thank you very much. I would like to look at our two development partners now, the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. These are two partners that have provided assistance for Guyana in developing its capacity to better manage the oil and gas sector, but we have seen nothing but silence when it comes to important matters that even strike at the heart of the loans that they are giving us in terms of building our capacity and building our capacity as it relates to monitoring the environmental issues that are of serious concern to Guyanese. How do you think we should look at this, and should it be of concern to Guyanese, the silence from these developmental partners?
It should be a concern, and it shouldn't be acceptable. I think the World Bank has standards that it is committed to adhere to in its loans, in its grant making, in the investments it makes in countries. I think what is particularly regrettable in the present circumstances is that years ago the World Bank had committed to stop investing, to no longer invest in upstream oil and gas production projects. It had committed to stop doing that, at least for oil. And it had committed to stop doing that as of 2020. The World Bank slid this loan program in under that deadline. But the fact that the World Bank has stopped funding in the space doesn't mean that its responsibilities to Guyana have ended. And so absolutely, I think it's responsible for, I think it's imperative for the World Bank, having helped get Guyana into this situation, to address the impacts that Guyana is facing and address the questions that have arisen. And here, I think the last thing I'll say is the fact that the World Bank recommended to Guyana that the law firm that should help Guyana rewrite its laws for this sector is the same law firm Exxon itself was using, is a testament to how little care the bank paid with this project.
Okay. Do you think the worst is yet to come if we don't get tough on ExxonMobil and the protection of our environment?
I think the answer there is an inescapable yes. I think the answer is Exxon has demonstrated that it will push these projects, it will push these permits to their very limits and beyond. It is demonstrated that even minor infractions will be fought. It is demonstrated that if there are loopholes in the permits, it intends to take full advantage of those loopholes. And these emissions will continue, and the risks are profound. Exxon launched lifting, and only then apparently discovered that it had a faulty compressor part. If that faulty part had been not the compressor but the blowout preventer, the situation that Guyana would be dealing with would be massively more severe. And the wells at Liza 1 are only the first of many wells, and the operations only get larger from here. And so I think it is absolutely imperative for the people of Guyana to insist on Exxon adhering to the highest environmental standards and to take a really serious look at the full suite of impacts and the full suite of risks they face as these operations go forward.
Thank you, sir. For our concluding aspect of the program, what are your final thoughts on the state of affairs in Guyana, the position that we're in, and what would be your advice to our new administration? Mr. Muffet, you're still with us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'm still here.
Go ahead.
As I've mentioned before, I'm reluctant to give advice to the new administration that I defer to the people of Guyana to do. What I can say is that, that UN human rights bodies recently asked Guyana to take a serious look at the human rights implications of these operations. Asked Guyana to take a serious look at how the oil and gas is being developed and what that says for transparency and corruption in the country. I think that my advice to the government would be to listen to the Guyanese people on this and to ask harder questions and not be intimidated by Exxon into silence or concession. And at the same time, my advice to all of the Guyanese people is to look skeptically at the promises that are being made here about vast wealth, because in country after country, those promises have not materialized and they've turned into a curse. And I'll say that I've gone through that production agreement, and I think, as I've mentioned to you, like as I go through that production agreement, it's like taking apart Russian dolls, looking for the smallest one, trying to figure out how much revenue is actually guaranteed to Guyana. And that's in a best case scenario where the price of oil is growing. But we have seen that the price of oil is not growing. The evidence that we are in a terminal decline for oil is accelerating. And what I think would be the greatest tragedy would be for the people of Guyana to be sold this promise, and for the promise to quickly turn into a curse, and for Exxon to walk away, leaving the people of Guyana to clean up the mess.
Wow. Thank you very much for your insightful comment, sir. We do hope to have you back on the program. And to our viewers on Facebook Live, our listeners wherever you are, thank you for tuning in again for this discussion that's very critical to the movement that we're trying to do here, this national movement of educating Guyanese about the oil and gas sector and the different parts of it and why it should matter to everyone. Thank you very much for being part of the program again, sir, and good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you for having me.